We began the Farbrengen this afternoon that this Shabbos combines several inyanim. Inyanim that actually don't have any shaykhs one to another. Inyanim that come as separate one to another. First of all, it's Shabbos Parshas Boy. Secondly, it is Ches Shvat, 8 days in the month of Shvat. Thirdly, it is the Shabbos before Yud Shvat. Now, what does the Rebbe mean by all these inyanim can come out separately? Parshas Boy, as he immediately explained, Parshas Boy mustn't necessarily be on Ches Shvat. Ches Shvat mustn't necessarily be the Shabbos before Yud Shvat. Neither does Parshas Boy have to be the Shabbos before Yud Shvat, because as the calendar varies from year to year, we can sometimes have Parshas Va'era also the Shabbos before Yud Shvat. So each of these inyanim is something separate in itself. Now this Shabbos combines all these three inyanim together. The emes, the Rebbe goes on, whenever we have any inyan of a special day, it's as the expression goes kol yoyma v'yoyma avid avidete. Every day has its avodah which it requires for that given day. So if this is so, this applies to the day even when there is one inyan only for that day. So actually when there is one inyan for the day, our day is occupied by fulfilling the requirement of this given day. Here when we have several inyanim, being that whatever the Rebishter requests from Yidden, the Rebishter always gives Yidden koiches to fulfill this. HaKadosh Baruch Hu mevakish lefi koichan, according to the koiches what Yidden have, according to the strength that Yidden have. Therefore, when we have several inyanim to fulfill on one day, the Rebishter gives us an additional amount of strength so that we should be able to fulfill all of these inyanim that come out on this given day. Firstly, it's Parshas Boy. Now the name of the Chazarah is Boy. And this is something which we read in the Torah. Comes with a bracha before every aliyah, a bracha at the end of every aliyah. A bracha has the expression of Shem Hashem. We express the Rebishter's name, so this shows us how important, how chashiv this inyan is. Still, when we look at a name of a Chazarah, a name mustn't necessarily be the first word of the Chazarah. The Rebbe proves this at many occasions. A word is a key title to the whole Chazarah. And in this case, Itak is also not the first word of the Chazarah, and it is Parshas Boy. What does Boy mean? Boy means come. Obviously, Al Pidiktuk, the Rebishter could have expressed himself here to Moshe Rabbeinu and tell him, Leich, go to Moshe Rabbeinu. To Moshe, that he should go to Pari. Though we see, the Rebishter does not use this expression, and chose rather to use the expression of Boy el Pari, come into Pari. The Rebbe spoke about it here, as well as later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe spoke about it again, b'shayches to a Zohar in this week's Sedra. Rebbe explained as follows. Boy means come. There is a general kriya, there's a general call here. And naturally, if there is a call, it is automatically in a sinas koyach, it gives the strength for it as well. The Torah gives strength to a Yid and invites a Yid to come. To come where? If Torah invites him to come, where does Torah invite him? To come into a Davar Shebekdusha. To get closer to the Rebishter. To get closer to Kedusha. It's a general invitation expressed to every Yid, boy, come closer. That's why the Rebishter did not use the expression here, leich. Leich means to go. Leich im pashtus, im pshutus shel mikra, it would reflect the idea of Hashem instructing Moshe that Moshe should go and meet Pari. However, there's something deeper here in the Chazarah. That Rabbeinu Shalom here is expressing himself not only to Moshe Rabbeinu, but to each and every Yid at all times. And telling each and every Yid at all times, boy, come closer, get closer to Hashem. This is what the idea of Parshas Boy stands for. Together with it, it is also 8 days in the month of Shvat. B'negeya 8 days in the month of Shvat, we find in Magen Avraham, where he brings that the Ziknei Yehishua, the elders that lived in the days of Yeshua, their Yortzeit, they passed away on Ches Shvat. Rebbe mentioned it's a machlokes. There is another opinion which records it not for Ches Shvat, but rather for Hei Shvat, 5 days in the month of Shvat. But the Magen Avraham also brings the opinion of Ches Shvat, 8 days in the month of Shvat, being the Hilula, the Yortzeit, for these elders of Yeshua that lived in the days of Yeshua. And naturally, this is very appropriate to this Shabbos, because this Shabbos is the Shabbos before the Hilula Yortzeit of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So how much more so is it appropriate when we have an inyan what comes in the Shabbos before the Yortzeit, Shabbos that comes before, and the Shabbos also has an inyan of Yortzeit in it, and something which deals with the Ziknei Yeshua, which this is something which also comes as a preparation to the Yortzeit of Yud Shvat. These inyanim, the inyan of Ches Shvat, the day that Meisu Ziknei Yeshua, as well as the inyan of Pashas Boy, this is something which has been going on for years. However, in later years, since the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away on Yud Shvat, we also have the inyan of Yud Shvat. The inyan of Hilula of a tzaddik in itself is a very great day. As the Alter Rebbe explains in Igeras HaKodesh, Simin Zach and Simin Koyach, which is Simin Chav Zayin and Simin Chav Ches, but this is how the Rebbe referred to them. Zach means pure, Shem and Zay is Zoch. And in these two simanim of Igeras HaKodesh, that is where the Alter Rebbe explains in detail, in precise detail, the greatness of a day of a Yortzeit of a tzaddik. However, based on what Chazal tell us, that Shabbos minei mizborchen kulu yoimin, which means that Shabbos gives bracha to all the following days of the week. So if so, besides the greatness of Yud Shvat in itself, today's day, this Yom HaShabbos, is giving bracha into the day of Yud Shvat. So actually, the day of Yud Shvat is a very great day in itself, but in essence, it's receiving its greatness, its bracha, from today, from the Shabbos which comes prior to Yud Shvat. So this is where all three inyanim come into this Shabbos. It is Shabbos Parshas Boy. The date of this Shabbos is Ches Shvat, which already also has a shaykhus to the inyan of Yortzeit, being that on this day, Meisu Ziknei Yeshua, the elders that lived in the days of Yeshua, passed away on this day. And also the fact that this is the Shabbos before the Yortzeit of Yud Shvat. And while talking about the greatness of Yud Shvat, and what this means to us, because this is the Yortzeit of the Frierdiker Rebbe, here the Rebbe began talking about another inyan, and the Rebbe says this inyan actually is something which is not to his satisfaction. It's an inyan hamitzayah, saddened inyan. However, as we recite in Kagavna, Friday night, that all the evil things rest on Shabbos. So Mamela, there's no inyan of an inyan of klippe on Shabbos and so forth. There's no inyan of sitra acha on Shabbos. So obviously the Rebbe says it wouldn't do any harm if we will discuss this inyan in Shabbos as well. The Rebbe says there are constantly new inyanim being published, inyanim which are additional inyanim in Chasidus. Svarim from all the different rabbeim which are constantly being published. And the Rebbe says each time he raises the question, why is there a need for new inyanim to be published? Did everybody go through the old inyanim? And he always keeps on getting various excuses, as he expressed himself. Ein malchus negas bechavata. One kingdom does not touch the other kingdom. In other words, the fact that there are inyanim which we have not covered yet, and we have not learned all these inyanim, this is no reason to hold up the printing of new inyanim in Chassidus, because actually new inyanim in Chassidus are being revealed, which is allowing more and more people to have an open hand to all of these inyanim in Chassidus. The Rebbe said that is why he was sure that before Yud Shvat there would also be publications of suitable inyanim for Yud Shvat. He waited. Then he figured that at the latest by Rosh Chodesh Shvat he will see something. And he says we are already 2 days before Yud Shvat, and he hasn't seen anything proper amongst all the many new publications which are constantly coming out, something which should deal with the greatness of Yud Shvat, telling us about Yud Shvat and about the Frierdiker Rebbe and the lessons we can derive in our daily life from the attitude of the Frierdiker Rebbe and so forth. And the Rebbe says this reminds him on something which occurred these days. The Rebbe said he sent out a question to an individual whom he instructed to do something 4 months ago. In Tishrei, he instructed an individual to do something. Naturally, it's also something l'toivas haklal, for the benefit of the public. And 4 months passed, the Rebbe says, and he hadn't heard from this individual as yet. So being that we're already in Shvat, he wanted to find out what's going on with this project which he assigned to this individual. The response came that he had just written to the Rebbe several days ago a response on this inyan, on the instruction which he received in the month of Tishrei. And the Rebbe says, do you know what the response was? The response was that he turned over this inyan to somebody else. He instructed somebody else to take care of this project. And this, the Rebbe says, is not the type of response which he wants. And it's not a desirable response when the fact that we're getting instructions and to get it off our shoulders and to give it over to other people, to say that we'll assign it on somebody else should do it, then he says the inyanim, the things that have to be accomplished, will never be accomplished. Later in the Farbrengen, Rabbi said a Maimah in the form of a Sikha, as well as learned a Rashi and explained not only one Zohar but several Zohars in this week's Sedra. First, the Rebbe learned a Rashi in Parshas Boy in this week's Sedra. Pittel Yud Beis Pasik Mem Gimel. Kapitel Yud Beis Pasik Mem Gimel. Pasik tells us Vayomer Hashem el Moshe ve'Aaron. Hashem instructed Moshe and Aaron, and he told them, Zois chukas haPesach. These are the rules of the Korban Pesach. Kol ben necha lo yochel boy. And as the pasuk goes on with various detailed instructions regarding who can eat the Korban Pesach and who cannot eat the Korban Pesach. Actually, if we follow the Sedra, all the details of Korban Pesach were already discussed. Not only were the details of Korban Pesach discussed, but we've already read in detail how the Yidden went out of Mitzrayim. In fact, we read the pasuk that describes exactly Be'etzem Hayom Hazeh. It was the middle of this day. When this day, the 15th day in Nisan, when the Yidden left Mitzrayim. Now, after reading about all this, the Torah comes back. Hashem is addressing Moshe and Aaron. What is he telling them? These are the rules of the Korban Pesach. We just learned it. Not only did we just learn it, we passed it already. It's after eating the Korban Pesach, it's after slaughtering the Korban Pesach, it's after the eating of the Korban Pesach. The Yidden have already exiled Mitzrayim. Obviously, Rashi is troubled with this question. And that is why Rashi comments on this pasuk, Zois chukas haPesach. Rashi says as follows, Biyudaled b'Nisan nemra lehem parsha zu. That really, when was this parsha said? Not as it seems from the sequence of learning Chumash, but this was said several days ago. This was said on the 14th day in the month of Nisan. We have a rule, Ein mukdam u'ma'uchar b'Torah, that the Torah does not always follow a sequence of as in Yonim happened. The Torah could go back and tell us in Yonim that took place previously, and the Torah will discuss it later. So obviously this falls into the same category. We have already learned in the pasuk what has transcribed and what has happened on the 15th day of Nisan. Now the Torah is going back to tell us a parsha which Hashem instructed to Moshe and Aaron on the 14th day of Nisan. The commentaries on Rashi, the Rebbe continues, all get involved in a detailed explanation to explain this Rashi. Why? Why Take? The Torah has already told us all the details that are involved, all halachic requirements for Korban Pesach. Why is it that the Torah here comes back, again dealing with the dinim of Korban Pesach, and tells us a parsha which was really recited a day earlier? So, various Mefarshim Rashi, Rebbe Yoram Mizrahi, and others all explain in detail and elaborate on this Rashi here. Rashi himself does not say more than these couple of words. So obviously we must say that if Rashi himself does not say more than these couple of words, that it's understood, as the Rebbe keeps on stressing, to the 5-year-old, to the Ben Chomesh, Lemikra, it is self-explanatory without any more elaboration from Rashi. It is obvious what Rashi is out to explain here, and the reason for it as well. The Rebbe explains as follows, with the introduction of another question. Rashi quotes the words, Zois Chukas HaPesach. These are the details of Pesach. And Rashi says this Pirush. We already know that not only is every word in Rashi extremely accurate, but as well the words from the Pasuk which Rashi quotes are as equal accurate. Rashi quotes which words? Kol ben Neicha. Obviously, Rashi should have quoted the opening words of the Pasuk. The Pasuk begins, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, that the Rebbe is just starting to talk to Moshe Rabbeinu and is giving him detailed halachas b'negei Korban Pesach. So Rashi should have told us, you know when this took place? When was this Vayomer Hashem el Moshe? When did Hashem address Moshe and Aaron? He addressed them on the 14th of Nisan. Rashi waits. He does not quote these couple of words of the Pasuk. As we go further into the Pasuk uses the word Zois Chukas HaPesach. Here Rashi comes to tell us when was this Pashas recited on the 14th day of Nisan. Truthfully, we find in other places in Chumash where Rashi gets involved in explaining this inyan of Ein Mukdam U'Ma'ucha B'Torah, that the Torah is not accurate to the extent of relating what has transcribed first and later, earlier and later, in a proper sequence. In other words, in Yanim that took place later, the Torah could tell us about them previously. And in Yanim that took place earlier, the Torah will tell us about them later. Very first place is in Chumash Bereshis. In Chumash Bereshis, we read how Terach, the father of Avraham, passed away. This is how Parshas Noach concludes. Then we come to Parshas Lech Lecha. Vayomer Hashem al Avram, Hashem instructed Avram, Lech Lecha me'artzecha me'meladetecha me'beis avicha. That he commanded him to travel and go away from his father's home. Actually, this commandment on Lech Lecha came prior to the passing of Terach. So that is where Rashi gets involved in a detailed explanation and explains us and gives reason why the Torah tells us about Terach's passing before the other commandment to Avraham of Lech Lecha. So we find an inyan of a mukdam and mucha b'Torah, and Rashi explains it. Rashi gives the reason for it. Here, Rashi does not give any reason for it. Just Rashi quotes the words Zois Chukas HaPesach, does not quote the words from the Pasuk Vayomer Hashem el Moshe v'Aaron, and Rashi tells us when was this Pasha said on 14 days in the month of Nisan. Rabbi learns Pshat as follows. We must say that all the explanation lies in the words of the Pasuk Zois Chukas HaPesach. The emes, the Yidden were told the details how to bring the Korban Pesach. These details they were told really before the 14th day of Pesach. Actually, as of Rosh Chodesh, HaKadosh Baruch Hu began instructing Moshe Rabbeinu as of Rosh Chodesh Nisan exactly what the Yidden are required to do to bring the Korban Pesach. Furthermore, they were required to purchase the Korban Pesach at least 10 days in the month of Nisan, keep the Korban Pesach in their homes, and check it carefully to make sure that there is no mum in the Korban Pesach, which required 4 days of bedika, 4 days of checking. So the question arises, another question comes up. Here HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling Moshe Rabbeinu, Zois Chukas HaPesach, these are the details of Korban Pesach. Kol ben neichel lo yochel boi, and goes on. Whoever is not a Yid cannot eat from the Korban Pesach. When are we told this? We are told this on the 14th of Nisan. It's too late. Nobody can go ahead on the 14th of Nisan and join in and buy a Korban Pesach. Nobody can go ahead and bizach mal, or nobody can go ahead and bizach megaya and still be able to take part in the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim on that given year, if until you Dalid Nisan you had not purchased a Korban Pesach and joined in on the Korban Pesach. So actually, what is the Torah talking about here? It is on the 14th of Nisan, after all the dinim of Korban Pesach were already learned, and here the Torah is telling us you should know Zois Chukas HaPesach. This, with a finger pointing, Zois Chukas HaPesach, you shall know these are the details of Korban Pesach. Who is allowed to eat the Korban Pesach and who is not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach. All of this should have been told much earlier. That he has to be gemalt. If he's not a Yid, he's not allowed to eat from the Korban Pesach. When is he going to go ahead and take care of this?
Can do it in one day, right?
Cannot be done in one day, especially as the requirement was for Pesach Mitzrayim. This detail of buying the Korban Pesach 4 days earlier and checking it, this was only in Pesach Mitzrayim, in the Pesach which the Yidden were makriv in Mitzrayim. However, Pesach Deiris, as it is called, the Korban Pesach which the Yidden were makriv in all the later years in the Beis HaMikdash, did not have this requirement. With this in mind, the Rebishter is addressing Moshe Rabbeinu here and Aaron, and is telling them as follows: Zois Chukas HaPesach. Wherever we find an expression in the Chumash, Zeh or Zois, it means we are pointing with our finger. Here we are pointing with the finger on the Korban Pesach. Why? Because this parsha was said when on the 14th of Nisan. So on the 14th of Nisan, everybody was around with the Korban Pesach. Everybody had a Korban Pesach in front of them. So the Rebbe is telling Moshe, you tell the Yidden, Zois Chukas HaPesach, all the details of Korban Pesach. And these details, Taka, were not pertaining the year that the Yidden were in Mitzrayim. All these instructions which Chumash is discussing here pertain to the Pesach Deiros, which will be negated to the Yidden as far as bringing a Korban Pesach in all the future years. Why did the Rebishter tell this parsha on the 14th day of Nisan, as opposed to all other details which were told earlier? Because prior to the 14th of Nisan, it was impossible to say Zois Chukas HaPesach. You couldn't point on the Korban Pesach. You didn't have a Korban Pesach in front of you to point Zois. All you had was the behemoth. You had the behemoth. It wasn't slaughtered yet. People weren't eating it yet. They weren't mekayim the mitzvah of eating the Korban Pesach yet. However, as it came to the eve of Yudalad Nisan, that is when everybody was able to pinpoint on the Korban Pesach, Zois. This is the Korban. And this is exactly what the Pasuk is telling us here. Rashi sees the words, Zois Chukas HaPesach. We're pointing on the Pesach and saying, Zois Ot. Here, right in front of our eyes, is the Korban Pesach. So Rashi is commenting, do you know when this parsha was recited? This was recited on the 14th day of Nisan. Now, is there any need for Rashi to elaborate more? No. Rashi does not have to go into a long discussion as the commentaries on Rashi do, because it's so obvious, and that is why Rashi quotes the pasuk Zois Chukas HaTorah. Rashi does not quote the words Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, because Vayomer Hashem el Moshe va'Aaron does not show us in any way, does not reflect that this parsha was recited on the 14th day of Nisan. Has no shaykhs. However, as we go deeper into the pasuk, we see the words Zois Chukas HaPesach. This is the chukah of Korban Pesach. In other words, the Korban Pesach, which we are discussing about right now, we have this Korban in front of us. Zois. This is it. This is the Korban Pesach. That is why Rashi tells us here on Zois Chukas HaPesach, when was this parsha recited? 14 days in the month of Nisan. Actually, true. This rule we already know. We know it from Chumash Bereshis, that the Torah at times could go back. Here we have already read Be'etzem Hayom Hazeh. We have read how the Yidden have left Mitzrayim, and now the Torah is coming back to discuss another parsha which the Rebbe has instructed Moshe Rabbeinu on the 14th of Nisan.
By Terach explains why the Torah changed the order.
By Terach there is need for it, and because of the Kibbud Av of Avram.
What's it here? Why doesn't Rashi explain?
Because why? Because it's already a klal in Torah. Rashi doesn't have to get involved into. Sometimes Rashi gets involved in explaining the details, and sometimes Rashi doesn't. However, the fact, obviously, I think if the Rebbe mentioned that first the Torah wanted to go through all the details of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Very good. First, the Torah went through all the details of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Here we are coming to dinim, which are not negayah to Yetzias Mitzrayim anymore. This is something which is negayah for Pesach Deiros. That is why the Torah puts this afterwards. The went on in Ruchnias and discussed this inyan, being that Kol HaGoliyos al Shem Mitzrayim Nikru, all of the Golosim, the Golos we are in now as well, is also named Mitzrayim. So there are many similar things as there were in Golos Mitzrayim, not in the Golos we are in as well. The idea of Golos is to be enslaved. And this is something which Yidden don't want. A Yid wants to be free, without any bondage of slavery on him. He should be able to learn Torah, to serve the Rebishter. What's the pshat slavery? Just like we find by Mitzrayim, meleches noshim la'anoshim, and meleches anoshim la'noshim. There are certain positions, there are certain work which is suitable for women, and there's other work which is suitable for men. Once Paro went ahead and exchanged these things, this was the worst part of the shibud, the worst part of the exile in Mitzrayim. Same the Rebbe says, a Yid wants to be able to be involved in the learning of Torah without any interference, without any type of shibud. We want to live up to the idea of be'etzem hayoim hazeh, just like in Mitzrayim. It was in the midst of the day the Yidden walked out freely out of the exile of Mitzrayim. The same nowadays, we want to be able to go out of Golas and have the coming of Mashiach now. And as the Rebbe kept on stressing, ad mosai, Yidden are complaining how much longer do we have to be in Golas. Yidden want to be learning Torah without any yokes on them, without any limitations. And here the Rebbe brought a story from the Arizal. That the Arizal, certain period of his life, used to go every week onto a boat and spend the week until Shabbos on this boat, learning Torah there, without any interference. And his father-in-law supported him with all of his needs. And he wanted to be isolated, to not have anyone interfering with him learning Torah. Reb Chaim Vital, who was the closest disciple of the Arizal, and he saw how the Arizal was involved in Limud HaTorah. And the Arizal told him that why was it that he was so involved in the learning of Torah to such an extent that while he was learning Torah, he was literally sweating. In other words, he labored so in the learning of Torah that it brought him to sweat. So the Arizal explained to him that this was in order that he should be able to break the klippas, the inyan of klippa, which is existing in the world. So that is why he heard it so in the learning of Torah to be able to break klippa. And here the Rebbe commented, we can imagine the type of klippa which was around the Arizal. I mean, type of person we're talking about is the Ariya Kodesh, the Arizal. What type of klippa could have been close to the Arizal? But again, we see that the inyan of a Yid is to be able to learn Torah freely. In fact, there is a Zohar that interprets B'chomer u'bilveinim. Pasuk tells us that while the Yidden were enslaved in Mitzrayim, they were laboring very hard, B'chomer u'bilveinim, working hardly with bricks and with and smearing the bricks that the brick should hold in the construction that they did in Mitzrayim. So the Zohar interprets B'chomer do libun hilchese, u'bilveinim do kal v'chomer. What does that mean? That there's the same idea of working hard as far as learning Torah. Libun hilchese means to crystallize and pure and come down and understand the halacha properly. And in order to understand Torah properly, it's not easy. There's also a certain amount of haravanya, of yigia, as the expression goes, yagaito matzasa. That's the only way one can succeed. So there's an inyan of chayma, leveinim da kal v'chayma. We know that we recite daily in davening Rabbi Shmuel b'shloshes hamidos haTorah nedreshes, b'kal v'chayma b'gzeira shava. Kal v'chayma is one of the methods of learning Torah, and for one to be able to understand the kal v'chayma properly, it's also not easy. So what we are really anxious for, we should have the inyan of a yoke upon ourselves, and we should be in this sort of a slavery. But what type of a slavery? A spiritual slavery to learn Torah. We should be released from all other inyanim, and we should be able to learn Torah without any interference, and all our needs, whatever we need to sustain ourselves and our families, the Rebbe should give us. Miyadai hamleya hapsucha hakdeisha v'achava. The Rebbe should give it, that we should really have it to the fullest extent and to the fullest measure. And when Yidden will be in such a position, they'll really be able to dedicate themselves to learn Torah properly. As customary in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe also went on to learn a Zohar in this week's Sedra. In fact, he got involved in 2 Zohars in this week's Sedra, in today's Farbrengen. Briefly, the Zohars deal with it, the inyan of mezuzah. This week's Sedra we read that while the Yidden were in Mitzrayim, They had to take from the blood of the Korban Pesach and put it on their doorposts, where we keep our mezuzah now. Allah mashkoif, Allah mezuzah. And this saved the lives of the Yidden. Any doorpost, the Rebbe saw that had the blood on it, smeared the blood, the Rebbe knew it's a Jewish house. And thereby skipped over this house, and this house was not plagued in any way. So the Zohar discusses the whole concept of mezuzah. And that mezuzah brings about, the mezuzahs that we put on today, brings about HaKadosh Baruch Hu should guard the home that has the mezuzah. And the Zohar says something very interesting. That mezuzah, in numeric value, is the same total as Adnai, which is the name of Hashem. Mezuzah is spelled Mem, Zayin, Vav, Zayin, Hey. Mem equals 40, Zayin is 47, and Vav is 47 and 6 is 53. Again Zayin is 60, and the Hey at the end of mezuzah is a total of 65. Adnai is spelled Aleph Daled Nun Yud, which is the name of Hashem, gives us the same total. Aleph Daled is 5, Nun is 50, and Yud is 10, which gives us a total of 65. However, the Rebbe raised the question, and the Rebbe says, why do we have to come on to all this? We know that on the outside of the mezuzah is the shame of Shin Daled Yud. In fact, the shame Shin Daled Yud has to be written on the mezuzah directly behind the V'hoya of V'hoya Im Shemaya. Behind the V'hoya comes the shame of Shin Daled Yud. Shin Daled Yud is a shame which is very appropriate to mezuzah. Why? Because this shame abbreviates Shemer Dalsois Yisrael, that the Rebbe is the one that guards the Jewish homes. So if on the mezuzah we have the shame of Shin Daled Yud, for what need is it that we should get involved that the mezuzah totals Adnai? Because without this, it's also reflected the idea that mezuzah is something. The concept of mezuzah is how HaKadosh Baruch Hu guards the Jewish home. While discussing this inyan, the Rebbe raised another question, which this question is raised in the Zohar. The Zohar raises the following question. We know there are inyanim in this world that are chesed, and there are inyanim that reflect gevura. If one was to be asked, what does blood stand for? Is it chesed or gevura? Obviously, blood is gevura. Here the Torah tells us, take something which reflects the idea of gevura, put this onto your doorposts, and this will bring about a result of chesed, a step of chesed whereby HaKadosh Baruch Hu will notice the blood on the doorpost, and this will rescue the life of the people that are within the house. So Rebbe says this question is raised in the Zohar, and the Zohar itself, there are various Tanoim which give different interpretations on this question. Basically, the answer that is given, that we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu instilled in this dam, the Rebbe explained it, such a koyach that though dam usually stands for gevura, here after the mitzvah was performed with the dam received this strength that it can be nepach, it can be turned over and accomplish an act of chesed. Why? All because the instruction of Hashem was followed with this inyan by fulfilling the instructions of Hashem and being makriv the Korban Pesach and sprinkling the blood and so forth. Another inyan which is discussed in the Zohar raises the same question which the Rebbe asked in the first Sicha. Why is it that the Torah uses the expression boy el Parai, come into Parai? HaKadosh Baruch Hu instructed Moshe Rabbeinu to go to Parai. So he should have used the expression leich el Parai, go into Parai. And the Zohar gets involved how HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu that he shall go into the Parai. Parai resembled the strongest klippa of that generation. Parai was the one who declared he does not realize in the existence of Hashem. He does not recognize Hashem. So the Zohar uses the expression b'negei Parai, hatanin hagodel. He was the big fish, in other words, in klippa of that generation. And here HaKadosh Baruch Hu is taking Moshe Rabbeinu and sending him to go ahead and break the strongest klippa that existed in that generation. So the Zohar is getting involved in a whole lengthy explanation, raising the question why the pasuk uses the expression boy rather than leich. The Rebbe asked the question as follows. If we look carefully, the Rebbe says, this is not the first time Moshe was sent by Hashem to Pari. Moshe was already sent by Hashem to Pari at previous occasions as well, to warn him that he should release the Yidden, at many, many occasions. Where are all these occasions discussed? In Pashas Vayera. Let us turn back to Pashas Vayera and see whether there the expression that is used by the Rabbeinu Shalom is an expression of leich, or is it an expression of boy? And if we look back to Pashas Vayera, Rebbe says we find quite a few times that the expression of boy is used. Once it is used leich, whereby Moshe went out to meet Pari on the water. There he did not enter to the palace of Pari. So the expression of boy cannot be used there altogether. That is why the Rebbe had to use the expression leich. However, where he did come into Pari and went into Cheder Lefnim Cheder, and he went into the Heichal of Pari, the expression of boy can be used as well as the expression of leich. Obviously, leich is more suitable. Still, we see that the Torah and Pashas Vayera also uses the expression boy. So the Rebbe is asking if the Zohar is troubled with the fact, why does the Rebbe the Torah use the expression boy and not leich? Why doesn't the Zohar ask this question in Pashas Vayera and wait till Pashas boy and doesn't ask it in Vayera? Vayera is before boy. The Rebbe says it could be that the Zohar, the Tanoim, in other words, Rab Shimon, and Stam Rab Shimon mentioned in Zohar as Rab Shimon ben Yochai, who was the author of Zohar, could be that they had this question already in Pashas Vayera. And they discussed it, B'negeya, the boys that are mentioned in Pashas Vayera. However, when they were Masada, the Sefer HaZohar, they preferred, for whatever reason, to enter this inyan into Pashas Boy. However, the same explanation and interpretation which they give in boy can as well apply to the boy, to the word boy that is used previously in Pashas Vayera as well. But the Rebbe says it's hard to say so. Usually we know that when a question arises, that is where the question has to be discussed. Furthermore, the Rebbe says it seems from the Hezber, from the explanation that is given in the Zohar, that this whole inyan of boy has a shayches, as it's explained in the Zohar, taka to Pashas boy. So why is it that the times that the expression of boy is used in Va'era, the Zohar does not raise this question? And only when Pashas boy begins with the word boy, that is when the Tanoim asked the question, the expression should have rather been leich than boy. These are the questions which the Rebbe raised b'negeya the Zohar. Afterwards the Rebbe said, being it's the Shabbos before Yud Shvat, it would be appropriate to mention another inyan which has a shaykhs to Yud Shvat. And that is b'negeya the greatness, great importance of Nishei Yisrael, the Jewish woman and the Jewish mother, that is discussed in the Friedeke Rebbe Siches, where the Friedeke Rebbe writes the greatness that Chazal tell us about the Noshim Tzidkoniyas that lived in the generation of Mitzrayim, and it was they that sacrificed their lives and gave their lives in order to raise a proper Jewish generation that should go out of Mitzrayim and be the ones that when the Yidden crossed the sea, the Jewish children were the ones that were pointing at HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Zeh Keli V'Anveyu. They recognized HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is my God. Again, the expression Zeh, just like we learned here by Zois. Zeh and Zois is always an expression of pinpointing. And here we have the Jewish mother that raised such a generation of children that they were able to point on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They recognized HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it was the same Jewish mothers that not only showed such dedication to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Mitzrayim, but in the Midbar as well, they also showed an extreme dedication to HaKadosh Baruch Hu by the fact, as the Pasuk tells us, Vayavoyu ha'anoshim al hanoshim, that when it came to contribute for the Mishkan, the women were the ones that really ran first and ran ahead of the men to contribute for the Mishkan. Again shows another act of dedication which came from the side of the women. And at the same time, when the Yidden made the terrible mistake and made the calf, the Egel Hazor, the golden calf which they wanted to worship to, it was only the men that contributed to it, and the women refrained from contributing anything to the Egel. So it again shows that the women in that generation were of extreme, possessed within them an extreme amount of dedication to the Rebbe. And here the Rebbe says that there is a Kisvei Arizal that tells us that the women that are going to live in the generation of the coming of Mashiach are a Gilgul of those women that were in the generation of Yetzei Mitzrayim. And the Rebbe says there are no doubts, and we don't have to look for simonim and for any other types of additional signs. We know that we are already living in this generation where we are already expecting the coming of Mashiach. So it's most appropriate, again, to say that the Nashim Tzidkoniyas that are in this generation are the same Nashim Tzidkoniyas that lived in the generation of of going out of Mitzrayim and going into the Midbar, where the Nishei Yisrael showed such a great amount of dedication to the Rebishter. So the same the Rebbe went on is demanded from Jewish women nowadays, and particularly now that we're standing before Yud Shvat, and the Frierdiker Rebbe in many of his sichas stresses and demands from the Jewish women the great and major important role they play, particularly b'negei chinuch, b'negei raising children. And here the Rebbe again stressed the importance of raising children as well as the willingness of the women to increase the size of the families. The Rebbe keeps on talking lately. It's very strong against the whole idea of birth control, and on the contrary, the larger a Jewish family is, this is the proper beauty of a Jewish family, as the Rebbe elaborated at previous occasions. And here, before Yud Shvat, and the Rebbe quoted a pasuk. There's a pasuk that tells us, Ha'asiri yiyah kodesh. The pasuk is talking b'negei ma'isa, b'negei something else. However, what we derive from the pasuk is that anything which revolves with the inyan of Asiri, inyan of 10, reflects an inyan of Kedusha. Mela, when we're talking b'negei Yud Shvat, which is a day where we have to awaken ourselves, Sai Anoshim, and as well Noshim, as the Rebbe just explained, it's a proper day to awaken ourselves to inyanim of Kedusha as inyanim of Kedusha should be. And here the Rebbe quoted the Rebbe Maharash, that this year is the 100th year from the passing of the Rebbe Maharash, and we know what the Rebbe Maharash stands for the inyan of L'Katchila Ariba. L'Katchila Ariba meaning that when it comes to inyanim of Kedusha, we do not. The Rebbe Maharash expressed himself once in Yiddish, the Welt sagt, a mekenicht arunter geht men a ribe. In other words, when we can't go under, that is when we go over. But ich sag, this is what Rebbe Maharash said, that he himself says, he advises, l'katchila a ribe, that in any approach, in any inyan which we have to get involved, we should, our immediate approach should be to go over, not under. And the Rebbe keeps on stressing at many, many occasions, and today as well, this lesson which the Rebbe Maharash has instructed us, that b'negeya all inyanim of Kedusha, all inyanim of Yiddishkeit, any inyan a Yid comes into contact with, the attitude of a Yid should be l'katchila ariber. In other words, shouldn't hesitate, and shouldn't be reluctant, and shouldn't be fakvetched, and perhaps it'll work out, perhaps it'll not work out, should he or shouldn't he, etc. The attitude of a Yid is l'katchila ariber. He knows that his immediate approach is to go over. And if he goes over, that is when he will succeed. The Rebbe also referred to an inyan which the Rebbe discussed in recent Farbrengens, a taich of the Tzemach Tzedek, which is also appropriate to the inyan of Yud Shvat, which is something which the Frierdiker Rebbe demanded very strongly, and kept demanding from all of us in a very strong way. Yosef Hashem li bein acher. This is a pasuk in Chumash Bereishis, where Rachel expressed herself when her child Yosef was born. And she thanked HaKadosh Baruch Hu for giving her the son Yosef, and asked Yosef Hashem, that Yosef means addition, adding, that Hashem should add her an additional child. However, there's a Hasidische taich, which teiches, Yosef Hashem li bein acher. It's the tafkid, it's our goal. Our objective is to take the one who is in the meantime still considered an acher, he's an outsider, and to bring him into the category of a bein, of a son to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is the taich of the pasuk, as the Rebbe spoke a few weeks ago, because otherwise, why does the pasuk have to add the word acher? All she could have said was, Yosef Hashem li bein. She's begging Hashem that he should give her another child. What need is the word acher in the pasuk? However, this has a pnimizdik interpretation. Chassidus teaches us that this is the whole inyan of a Yid. An inyan of a Yid is to always add on in Kedusha. to see to it that even though there are those Yidden who in the meantime are still considered achers, they are outsiders, they are others, they are not part of us. What do we have to do? Our inyan is to take this acher and bring him into the category of a bain. He shall be considered a proper bain, a proper child to the Eibishter. So now that is the days before Yud Shvat, it is extremely appropriate to keep this in mind, the Rebbe stress, and particularly with the strength that the Rebbe Maharash gives us, that we can go look at Chila Rebbe. We will definitely succeed in this mission of reaching out to all Yidden, that anyone who is still in the category of an Acher will ultimately become Ois Acher, and will be brought into a category of a Bain, of a proper son, being deserving this title, being a Bain to the Rabbeinu Shalom. Here the Rebbe quoted a Medrash on the Sedra which we began to read this afternoon. And this Medrash, the Rebbe says, is brought in the Mamorim of the Rebbe Maharash. Vayhi b'shalach Pari Yisrael, when Pari sent out the Jewish nation. So the Medrash says, b'shalach, pashtus means sending. However, there's another word which has a shaykhus to the word of shalach. Shiluach. In Gemara we find, in Mishnah in Gemara we find the word shiluach. This pertains b'negeya a tree that has grown and blossomed and really given off a lot of branches and and is taking up quite a bit of space. This is where we find the expression of shiluach. And this is what the Torah here tells us. Vayhi b'shalach Pari Yisrael, that the klippa of Pari was broken. Pari had to give in to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Pari was the one that was claiming he does not recognize the existence of Hashem. However, mi Hashem, who is Hashem? He's not listed in his directory, he's not listed in his dictionary, he doesn't know of his existence. So Pari finally gave under. And he had to realize in the existence of Hashem because he saw the strong hand of Hashem. The same is B'negeya Pari Ruchnius, which stands for the strongest of Klippa. This is also ultimately broken. And what happens, that Klippa in itself realizes the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is what happens. Vayhi b'shalach Pari Yisrael. Pari himself was the one that sent out the Jewish nation. In other words, Pari gave in to fulfill the request of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So ultimately what happens is that, just like we just spoke, Yosef Hashem li bein acher, the acher turns into a bein. The same thing, from the sending out of Pari, the klippah, the spiritual Pari, is turned into a shiluach, is turned into a beautiful blossoming tree.